President Salva Kiir has strongly denied UN allegations of ethnic cleansing in his country. Members of the UN Commission for Human Rights have been traveling around South Sudan for 10 days, and they say they've observed a steady process of ethnic cleansing, including massacres, forced starvation, gang rape, and the destruction of villages. Let's get you more now on this development. Liling Chan joins us live from New York. Liling, first off, several concerns raised by the UN this week over South Sudan, but government is denying any ethnic cleansing. How frustrated and worried is the UN at this stage of South Sudan?
Well, as you can imagine, this is very frustrating for the UN agency involved in trying to ease the tension and trying to help the humanitarian situation. Now, you mentioned that visit, the report on Thursday that we heard from the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, saying that ethnic cleansing is already well underway. They reported accounts of the use of starvation, burning of villages, as you mentioned, gang rape, as well as tactics of ethnic violence. So the UN Commission is very worried. It warned that South Sudan is on the brink of catastrophe, and that given how the country is home to some 64 different tribal groups, there are multiple fault lines along which South Sudan could further fracture. So it's a very frustrating situation. 24 hours after we saw that report, we heard again from the Commission saying that it was calling for a UN investigation into reports of increasing sexual violence as well, with the chairperson of the Commission, Yasmin Suka, saying that, lamenting that even though South Sudanese women continue to face sexual violence on a daily basis, that the world is averting its eyes. She said that it is an obligation, it is the international community's obligation to prevent this kind of violence and to also prevent mass bloodshed and to keep the situation from spiraling out of control to the point where it could be like what we saw in Rwanda. Already this year, we've heard numerous warnings from the UN about how the situation, how there is the potential for genocide in South Sudan. So this has been an extremely frustrating and infuriating situation for UN agencies that are trying to help resolve this crisis.
Now, President Kiir has met with his South African counterpart. Will the UN be looking for South Africa's help with the crisis in South Sudan?
Well, that's unclear at this point. It's uncertain to what extent the UN will be seeking South Africa's help. At this point, we do know that the opposition leader Riek Machar is in South Africa, so it stands to reason that South Africa could and should have some say in the matter. But given that the relationship between the UN and South Africa is somewhat tenuous now, we saw reports, of course, of South Africa withdrawing from the UN's International Criminal Court. So given that the tension between the UN and South Africa as well, it's unclear to what extent the UN will be seeking South Africa's help here and to what extent they will collaborate on trying to resolve this crisis.
And those 4,000 extra peacekeepers have still not been deployed. What's the time frame on that deployment, and which countries in the region will be sending troops?
Well, we know several countries on the African continent will be sending troops, and we do know that this is a 4,000 strong deployment force. Now, South Sudan has agreed to allow this force to operate in the country. However, it's still unclear at this time when that deployment will start. Now, we do know that the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan is asking for this deployment to happen much sooner than later because of the dire situation in South Sudan right now.
All right, Liling Chan in New York, thank you.